Okay, everybody, I don't want to be the one that's responsible for us running late because we've been on time so much. So I'm very pleased to be here, and I'm Roggeveen. I'm at Babson College, and I actually met Dawn 22 years ago when we had a phone call when I was interviewing for the PhD program. You were in New Hampshire, I remember, which is close to my heart. And my impression after that phone call was this is somebody that's direct, that's down to earth, and that's supportive. And those three qualities have remained my impression throughout all of these years. And so today I'm really excited to get to introduce three fabulous speakers that are going to talk about marketing strategy. But rather than tell you about all of their accomplishments, I thought it would be more fun for you to have a story about how each of them first met Dawn. And so I asked them to share that with me. And I'm pleased to share these stories with you. So the first is from Leigh McAlister, who's at University of Texas. I'm going to read to you, actually. The first time I met Dawn was at an ACR meeting. He had Chris in a chair, and he was lifting her into the air. Someone said the hotel doesn't have a gym, and so Dawn was improvising. She says, that was a lot for a little girl from Oklahoma to take in. The second time I met Dawn was at the first ever marketing science meeting. I was a newly launched professor and scared to death. My session followed a popular session, and I was disheartened to see everyone get up and leave after the popular session. That is, everyone except Dawn. He stayed on and listened to my presentation, which was probably about as easy to do as lifting his chair holding Chris. But Dawn is the man. He can do it. She says, Dawn is my hero. He's who I want to be when I grow up. Greg Carpenter is going to be our second speaker, and he's going to talk about the current research and marketing strategy. And when I asked him about his story about first meeting Dawn, it was when he was an MBA student applying to the PhD program at Columbia. And he talks about, and I remember well, Dawn's pro seminar, you had to write a research paper. And that research paper, Dawn worked afterwards with him, encouraged him in writing it, and it was their first publication together. And the third speaker that we're going to have today is Praveen from Tuck. And Praveen wrote, I first met Dawn in the summer of 1989 when I joined the doctoral program at Columbia, and I enrolled in a seminar course for the summer. In our first meeting in the corridor outside his office, I said, Sir, thank you for admitting me to the PhD program. His first reaction was, Praveen, you're never going to call me sir again. It's either Dawn or Coach. To which Praveen replied, yes, sir, I will call you Professor Lehmann. By then, Dawn was getting a little angry. I think he was thinking what a Dumbo we admitted. But being at Dawn, he controlled himself and said nicely, looks like you didn't hear what I just said. You can call me Dawn, or you can call me Coach. As you may know, it's not easy to kill an old Indian of his habits. And so Praveen said, okay, Dawn, sir, because that's how we referred to professors in India. Dawn then gave up and went back to his office. It took Praveen the whole summer and the whole seminar course to be comfortable calling him Dawn. So I'm excited to turn the microphone over to Leigh first to talk about some of the past research.
Thank you. Clicker?
Yeah.
Something for every hand. Okay, before I start, over lunch, Jeff Inman, Carl, and I were thinking that here we have a bunch of wonderful doctoral students from Columbia and all the mentors in the world, and we decided that all the doctoral students should pick out a mentor and go talk to them, and you all have your pay it forward. I want you to all pretend like you're Dawn because I've launched these students at you. And there are a few of the doctoral students I haven't found yet. I need for you to come and find me after this session so we can choose the right mentor for you. So welcome them. Listen to their research ideas. Help them do for them what Dawn did for you. Okay, strategy. A history. This is not the format I'm accustomed to speaking in. I've been told you came up with this, Donald. Sir, Donald, sir, yeah. So is white forward and red's backward? Who knows, huh? Give it a try. Okay. No, that must not have been the right way. Oh, no. Okay. Here we go. When did marketing strategy start? After World War II, General Electric invented marketing, pretty much. They focused on consumer wants. They revolutionized things by marketing being introduced at the beginning of the production cycle rather than at the end, and even moved marketing up to the top management team. So what we got going along down here is a timeline. This is going to be a timeline of what's going on in marketing research. Then there's going to be a Don timeline. Then there's going to be a management research timeline. Okay. So, but we didn't get around to doing research on this until 1965. We found out what is it. We asked, or Heiss went out and asked people, what is it that marketers do? Research, more so at big companies than at little companies. Probably some advertising, little packaging, pricing, but not the most sophisticated strategy research. But it was our beginnings of understanding sort of here, GE has invented it, they're making money with it. We're trying to figure it out so we can teach it to our students. 1967, Kotler wrote his first edition and began to codify it for us. The 4 C's, STP, the 4 P's. I'm going to call these insight, strategy, and execution. So this is what all our textbooks still talk about. And we talk about them as if every marketing department did all of these. But we'll see as time goes on what we've actually learned. So insight, strategy, and execution, things that need to be tightly coordinated to make the magic work. And then the Donald got his PhD from Frank Bass at Purdue. So there he is. 71, more people, well, so this is what marketing does, but does it work? So we asked some fairly naive questions. Is it the most important development since World War II? 61% of the people said yes. I'd like to know who this sample is. Marketing concept effective? 82%, yes. This was the MSI group, I guess, I don't know. Marketing concept yields products that fit customer needs, 90%. We were hitting on all cylinders there. 72, we ask again, what does marketing do? So we're losing. We used to be 92%, now we're down to in consumer versus industrial, but it's basically just questionnaire without very deep concern delving into the nature of the marketing function. Okay, now I'm starting on some management strategy. Henry Mintzberg, The Structuring of Organizations. This is a piece of management research that's just absolutely fundamental that anybody in practice, if I say line function versus staff function, anybody, my husband tells me he used to run factories for 3M, anybody's going to know what we're talking about. Say that to my colleagues in marketing, and many of them aren't aware of this distinction. And as we go through, even though I'm not allowed to talk about the future, I'm going to talk about the future and say, thinking about, so here's the thing. Manufacturing and sales are almost always line functions. They're the people that have responsibility for growth of the firm. They make the decisions that roll things along. Staff people advise line people. Accounting, HR, almost always staff. We're the only one that's sometimes staff, sometimes line. That's why we aren't hitting 100% on is marketing doing all these things. But what do our textbooks say? They don't say it outright, but what are we leading our students to believe? You get a job in marketing, you're going to do insight, strategy, execution. Well, yeah, if you go to P&G or General Mills, not at every firm. So before we leave here today, we're going to all take a pledge to think more deeply about the nature of the marketing function based on what Mintzberg told us. So this is Mintzberg's classic picture. This is the line function. There's top management. These are the line people doing the things that makes the company grow. These are the staff functions, advising the line functions. So, line's responsible for growth, staff supports line, all the things I've just told you. There we are. Now we got some management literature starting up here that's going to help us understand the marketing function, the marketing organization, how it works, what it has authority over. And then we get, so I went through Don's resume and picked out the papers I classified as strategy, and here was the first one, JCR in 1978, talking about comparison sets, that frame of reference. How are we going to compete? What's our position? Here's our point of difference relative to what comparison set. So I call that one strategy. Don't you love this picture of Don? Notice other people found it out on the internet too, with his finger in his ear. I was at a doctoral consortium once and he tried to eat the microphone. And then he did another one with Greg. Maybe this was the very paper you were talking about, Greg, on competition. And then with Moore, Pessmer, and Lehmann on market structure. So very early on, he was hitting the strategy button hard. Next comes the next important piece of management literature that we're doing a great job of exploiting. Hambrick and Mason's upper echelons, the organization's a reflection of its top management team. So all we have to do is look at the nature of that top management team to get a feel for how the different functions are prioritized in the firm. So there it comes on the management line. Then Lush and Lakonishek in 1987 called the marketing concept the gospel of marketing. And they said, like other dogma, we tell business people to just accept its usefulness as an article of faith. And they were calling for, they said, it's good business practice. We got the preacher over there, but does it work? The research moved on in that direction, and the does it work? So we got our preacher, now we got somebody over here measuring things. And it was the firm's market orientation. I believe Greg's going to talk about this stuff too. So it was our first attempt to not just sort of say, what percent of firms does the marketing function have control over research? Now we're saying, how market-oriented is the firm? That's a really different question. Narver and Slater, Jaworski and Coley, they found that in commodity firms, market orientation is a bad thing, brings ROA down. But in differentiated firms, marketing orientation increases ROA. It depends on the firm's strategy, and that the firm's strategy is going to drive the way the organizational structure is built, whose line and whose staff. And many others have measured the firm's market orientation and shown that it's related to firm success. So, firm does marketing activities well, the firm performs better. So now we've got market orientation on our development of marketing line. Well, what's this about the firm? Firm does marketing well. Marketing does marketing, right? So, marketing textbooks, these are our functional silos, manufacturing, IT, finance, marketing. Marketing textbooks all make it look like all of insight, strategy, and execution live in the marketing silo. But it could well be that insight, strategy, and execution are scattered across different functional silos. not going to be done as effectively here. If the key is to have strategy built on insight and execution tied closely to strategy, and you put them all in one functional silo, you're more likely to get them done. If you spread them across, then it's going to be harder to get the coordination, harder to do well. And I think it's this kind of situation that led us to measures of market orientation for the firm. How well is the firm serving customers? How well is the firm doing this and that? Then Holmberg, Workman, and Cromer come along and measure marketing's influence in the firm. And they say, so this raised fist is marketing is powerful. In some firms, marketing does all of these. Some firms, only 27% of the firms does marketing do pricing, but in 27% they are doing pricing. So, and what they showed is when marketing has more authority over insight, strategy, and execution, the firm performs better. Does it work? So, Verhoeven, Leigh, I guess Holmberg, Workman, and Cromer just measured the dispersion. Verhoeven, Leigh remeasured and related it to firm performance. Yes, if you put more of it in the marketing functional silo, then the firm does better. They coordinate more tightly. So marketings do more marketing activity, the firm performs better. Market orientation or marketing department power, which is more important? And Chris has been sitting over here all day, but she's gone. At least Roland is, oh, there's Chris and there's Roland. And they said, well, which one matters? Is it market orientation or is it marketing power? And they found, Chris or Roland, this is a cold call. What did you find? Okay, good. So that's, I just read the abstract. I was going to say that it was both. Chris, do you agree with me or do you agree with? It's both. You're wrong, Roland. No. Both. Okay. Does marketing spending matter? So we've been looking at who gets to make decisions. Now let's look at how much money is spent. Mizik and Jacobson, where did that Ukrainian go? There she is. So I have a particular bone to pick with Natalie about this. Back before she was born, I was in my doctoral program at Stanford. I'm a nerd. I hung out with all the accountants. They were building these models with firm value on one side, and they'd put, are they LIFO or FIFO? Are they, all these accounting. I said, well, let's put marketing in there. And they said, nah, that's just marketing. Marketing wouldn't have any effect. And I said, and none of you are going to believe this, but it's really true. I said, oh, okay. Walked away from it like that could have been my publication, not Natalie's. So 25 years later, Natalie comes along, drops in marketing. Guess what? Yes, big impact. Do brands matter? We've heard this paper discussed earlier. And the answer to this is, Donald, what was the answer? Do brands matter? Good answer. Kusum, Scott, you want to debate with him on this? Or are we we're...
We agree with you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Then, do customers matter? Another paper we've heard about. Back when Sunil had hair. They did this very, very important paper that really launched a lot. Yes, Brent. Gupta, Lehman, Stewart. Anybody want to take issue with me? Any of the authors? Okay, good. Does the CMO matter? And Nathan Mahajan said, nope, doesn't matter. But quickly, 7 years later, followed by German Ebbs and Gruel and said, yes, the CMO matters. Your sample was too small, Nathan Mahajan. And now we're beginning to draw on this upper echelons research that when a firm has a CMO, that means the firm's going to be more market-oriented, and marketing's going to have more power. We can draw that inference because of what we're seeing in the top management team. And now, does marketing on the board of directors matter? Kim, where are you? Does it matter? Yes. Good answer. Okay. Forthcoming. Whitler, Krause, Lehmann. Yes, it matters. So it matters. Spending matters. But why? And when? And for which firms? And that's the into the future that I think this line versus staff is going to be it's a concept we need to be thinking about. Is the firm organized so that the marketing function is delivering growth, or is some other function charged with that and marketing's just supporting? Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, Leigh. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Don. It's a pleasure to be here. A pleasure to have a chance to chat about this. And let me just say before I talk about the presentation, the details of the story that Ann mentioned. I met you in your office first, famous office, as an MBA student. I was more than halfway through the program. I was already looking for a job. And Russ Weiner suggested I apply to the program, so I did. But I wasn't sure I was going to get in. And I hadn't applied to any other doctoral program. And the plan was if I got in, I'd come to Columbia. If not, I'd just continue on the plan I had originated when I started coming here. And on December 14th, 1979, you wrote me a letter. And I know that date because I have that letter. Now, my wife says I'm a pack rat, but I completely disagree. And immediately I enrolled in the program, and what that did is allow me, of course, to be part of this community and enjoy this career and get to know you and all the things people have said so wonderfully about you. But it changed my life and gave me this opportunity to, frankly, also avoid working for a living, for which I'm grateful. So thank you, Doug. Thank you. Okay, so strategy. I'd like to also put this in context of what Leigh said just a moment ago, which is I've heard two things today which I think are very interesting and which we'll try to address slightly in this, which is that the influence of marketing, it may not be as powerful as it used to be, but at the same time, as Leigh points out, the evidence is that marketing helps, it matters, it improves firm performance. So there's an interesting question, if it's so important and if it helps, why is the influence waning? So that's part of what we're going to talk about here. And to do that, I'd like just to talk about sort of my perspective here. This isn't advancing. Okay? Is that what I like to do, okay? There we go. So the question I'd like to address is how does marketing contribute to the success of the firm, really? And that's a broad question, and I'm looking at the present, of course, which makes it a little bit easier. But I'd like to focus really on three questions and pick up on one where Leigh left off in some sense, which is marketing's influence within the firm. A little bit more about market orientation from some current work that I've done on this and other people are doing. And then a bit on how this actually affects firm performance, which I like to use the term competitive advantage to describe. So what about the influence? So it's clear that from hearing Barbara Kahn speak and many other people who've said similar sorts of things about the changing role of consumers, that consumers are becoming more powerful, and so that you think that ought to lead to the rising influence of marketing departments and marketing. But is marketing really gaining influence in the firm? And I think the answer is mixed, and this is the evidence that Leigh suggests, reviewed. Verhoff and Leiblang say, firms perform better when marketing plays larger roles. The influence of marketing grew, according to Feng, Morgan, and Rigo, in 1993 and 2008. So that's positive. CMOs tend to have shorter tenures, although that seems to be increasing. They seem to have especially short tenures when growth slows, but apparently don't have quite as much influence over growth. And as Don pointed out, very few boards have members of marketing on the board. So there's not much influence at the top level, which is also, I think, a reflection of the power and status within the firm. And Don's study, just to be clear, the most recent one, is that, sorry? Kim's study, okay. Yes, yeah. Yes, thanks, Don. So it suggests that when more people with a marketing role in the board, revenue growth is stronger. So why wouldn't we like this? Well, I think part of it reflects what's happening in organizational culture, I'd like to say, and the changing role of marketing in this. The traditional view, as Leigh presented with General Electric, but also this idea that Peter Drucker, that marketing is the whole firm seen from the customer's point of view. And that's led to this idea that there is, in some sense, we have one concept of market orientation, whether it's from Colleen Jaworski. There's slight differences, whether it's behavior or whether it's culture. But we tend to think there's one objective goal of what a market-oriented firm should be, and the marketing department should be powerful and should have influence, and that's where the rewards come. I've certainly, it's been reflected in my work too. I work with Gary Gebhardt and John Sherry on looking at how firms change their culture. And we've looked at, again, aspiring to this one set of values that seems to produce the sort of outcomes that are associated with the empirical results Leigh mentioned. But the implicit assumption is there's sort of one ideal, that all firms that embrace the market orientation or embrace market orientation or where marketing is powerful should behave and operate in sort of similar ways and should at least have similar sorts of cultural values. So this is, I spent some time in the last few years looking at the research on organizational culture, and what they have has been a rebirth in this area, and it's not just this organizational structure, but there's this rebirth in the area and with this concept of organizational logics. And that is that a culture of a firm creates sets of beliefs and values which create certain logics for success. In a traditional market-oriented company, P&G or Unilever, the logic of success is the one that we embrace and know very well, about creating customers, produces profits, and growth. It's the market orientation we describe it as. But there's also many other different logics that can be created. If you're in a tech company, the logic for success is not the market orientation. And so if you're in a bank, the logic for success is different. So the two people, Basharov and Smith, have noted that, in fact, organizations don't just have one logic for success, they have multiple logics. And sometimes those logics are more compatible than others, and sometimes they conflict. Sometimes they have fewer logics, sometimes they have more. So bringing in this work from organizational behavior suggests, as Sunil suggested, a 2x2, where here the numbers have to do with the number of logics the firm embraces and the complexity or the conflict, the compatibility of those logics. So on the bottom right hand, we have what they call a dominant culture, which is where there's a one dominant logic that prevails over all others. A lot of CPG companies, I would argue, have historically been in this space, where the marketing was the most dominant function, and everyone had to adapt to that. On the upper right-hand corner is what they call an aligned culture, where the organization, there's competing logics, but they're aligned around a common goal. I think the example of this is Amazon or customer, what we describe today as a customer-centric company or consumer-centric company, where there's definitely conflict, but where there's some sort of organization. In the bottom left is what they call an estranged culture where you have a small number of inconsistent logics. So the example of this is something like the New York Times or a media company, where you have the editorial side, which has one logic for success, and you have the commercial side, which has a second logic for success. And I'll show you one example of this as well. In the top left, you have what they call a contested culture, lots of logics for success that are not very compatible. This is like the world in which we live, which is a university, where we have different success with students and success with faculty and alumni and benefactors, and they're related, but they're sometimes conflicting. Or the healthcare world, where you have physicians, patients, payers. These are not consistent logics, and they lead to tremendous conflict and contention. Now, my point about including this is I think what it suggests is that we've thought about organizations for a large part of our research implicitly assumes that organizations live down here, and our knowledge of marketing in the organization lives down here. But increasingly, there's lots of other organizations, and they resist marketing as a result. So healthcare is a great example. They resist it because they find some of the concepts inconsistent with their own logic. So here's an example. I had the experience of talking to a bunch of physicians about segmentation. One of them raised their hand and says, segmentation is immoral. We cannot, as a healthcare institution, they said, treat different people differently. Then if you raise the issue of lifetime value of a customer, this gets whole other issues, and you don't ever want to mention cannibalization. that's just a really bad subject. And my point of this is very important. This is a very important point, is that our language, not only is the logic we have completely alien to them, the language we use to think about these things, that makes absolutely no sense. And so we say, why aren't you embracing these ideas? Your organization will be more successful. They're looking at us and saying, I don't see how this fits in with the logic of the organization and how we can succeed using this. And so they resist. And what many people do in these organizations I've observed is they simply sort of repeat the same ideas over and over and over again. It reminds me the first time I went to a foreign country and observed someone trying to communicate with someone who did not speak the local language, and all they did was repeat the same things louder and more slowly. So saying segmentation louder and more slowly does not make people like it more, I can tell you. So this is the challenge. How do we really, if we want to be influential, I think part of it is how do we think about speaking these other languages and understanding the culture in which these things exist. So I've done a little of this. I've done some work, inadvertently actually, in these estranged cultures and contested ones. And I'll tell you just a little about the estranged ones because I think it's easiest to describe. And you'll see that maybe the tension that exists about the role of marketing in this. So this is a paper I wrote recently, came out JM on the wine industry. In the wine industry, what you see is two logics for success. One is very recognizable to us. It's this market logic. They succeed by creating customers. They survey what we like. They think of the winemakers as engineers or chemists who formulate these products based on consumer tastes. The critics who review these things are very influential, but they essentially are judges, like Consumer Reports would be a judge of a dishwasher. And the goal, of course, is financial success. There's a whole other group of people, sometimes in the same company, who look at the world very differently. Their purpose is not to create customers. Their purpose is to make something extraordinary. They look at us, by the way, as clueless when it comes to wine. They can give you a blind taste test, and there's lots of empirical evidence that shows that in blind taste tests, consumers can't tell red wine from white wine, by the way, let alone one wine from the other. So they think we're clueless. They look at these winemakers as artists or magicians. So the way you look at a product designer. Critics are not judges, but people who are open to influence, and success is not financial, but the admiration and respect of peers, having achieved something great. Now, firms follow both of these logics. Some are great commercial successes, others make great products. They don't make much money, but they make great products. But there's a tension that exists. And some firms, however, we discovered the interesting part about this was we found that people who found a third way that would bridge both logics and create market orientation in a different way. And they do that by explicitly rejecting market orientation. They say, we do not. So one winemaker I spoke with, I asked him, I said, how do you think about customers when you make wine? He said, I don't. I'm philosophically opposed to that. So what do? He said, I make what pleases me. Now, it turns out he's very customer-focused in an unconventional way. So they resolve this inconsistency in logics by coming up with an approach that resolves both logics, both problems. So we describe that as this, called the status game. They start with a vision. If they're successful, they celebrate the success of the genius who created it. They influence critics and other people who are influential in the industry. They take their show on the road and they persuade other people. And if they do all that well, they earn status. And if they earn status, that gives them influence in the industry to shape what people think, to create demand for their product, and to shape your competitors' actions, which then produces more status. Now, why do I mention this here also? Because I think, if you think, what struck me about this, two things. One is, this is the academic world too. How do we compete? We have an insight. We write the paper. We love the people who come up with the award-winning papers, the equivalent of the artists and magicians. We try to persuade other people of what we've done. We take our papers on the road. If we win status, we influence what people think. We create demand for us, and we influence the behavior of some of our peers. And so I would argue if you do this really well, you end up like Don Lehman, right? Influential, and what did people say yesterday? I wrote it down, shaping the trends that others will follow. And it's about driving the market, but doing it this way, competing in a somewhat unconventional, I think, somewhat different way. Okay, so the insights of this is that people who do this appear not to be customer focused, but are in fact actually are. They feign interest in making money. They don't see people at their wineries. They say they absolutely are opposed to any kind of customer input, yet, of course, they're spectacularly successful with their customers as well. Okay, last thing is about competitive advantage. How does marketing strategy create this advantage? And this goes back to the marketing concept. So just a bit of context. The marketing concept about giving people what they want is a very powerful idea, but it doesn't really specify any source of competitive advantage. It just says sort of a article of faith that if you do this well, you will win. One mechanism that Don and Klaus Fresnel and others suggested was customer satisfaction as a way to create this link and create the reward associated with that, and it does seem to be real financial gains associated with that. Outside of marketing, people in economics have focused on this concept of firm resources. First entry barriers, of course, and then firm resources. This is a very popular idea, the resource-based view of advantage. And more recently in marketing, we've had this idea about market driving strategy, shaping what customers learn as a way to create advantage, although there's been less empirical work on that. So this work also in organizational behavior that's relevant for this as well. And one very interesting stream of work that's, again, beginning to bubble up in different places is the role of status. So status is important because it's a socially held idea. Rajiv mentioned brand meaning. This is the same sort of idea, the power of brand meaning. It's something that doesn't exist within the firm. So it's not, as we would think of as a traditional sort of economic unique resource. It also is not always, however, a market-based logic. It's based on the social distinction of one brand over the other, and that may or may not be completely rational. So these status differences, and very important about these, can persist, creating what the sociologists call the Matthew effect. Those who have great success will continue to have great success because they have access to resources, access to things that lower status brands don't, just as social distinctions in the country persist. And in the wine industry, these brands that create the high status, as Ashley and I pointed out, also seem to have this effect. And this effect seems to be widely recognized in the wine industry. There's a famous producer in Bordeaux in France, a woman named Baroness de Rothschild, who's famous for having said, the wine industry is really very simple, just the first 200 years are tough. So winners get this high status. It's very difficult to compete. It shapes what consumers think. They get to define categories, set preferences within those categories, benchmarks, and earn premium prices as a result. Lower status firms struggle, and gaining status is challenging. Once attained, it can be enormously valuable. So if we look at strategy today, I think it's a important area, but it's one where the field is really challenged in some sense. People, our ideas are proven to be successful, but they're resisting them. And organizations where, like healthcare and others, where branding and marketing should be very important in improving the experience, and I would argue also improving outcomes as a result, they tend to be resisted because we don't understand the logic and we don't understand how to translate it into the meaning from their perspective. So the traditional function may or may not be useful, but we need to understand how the function operates in these very different situations, and that in some cases, adopting this different perspective, this market driving perspective, might be useful for actually shaping what people think and leading the market, which of course is the inspiration that so many of us have gotten from Don. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's really an honor to be here, and as Lauren says, I feel like a PhD student here. Before I get into the future, I want to tell you two short stories involving Don. The first one involves Carl Miller. Are you here? Carl is. Carl is here. And Sunil, are you there? So Sunil. The first one involves Carl, Sunil, myself, and Don. Second one involves myself, Don, and my wife. I was also a reject in the PhD program at UCLA along with Carl by Sunil. And at the same time, Don was kind enough to take me in. So that's the fact. That is a fact. But so actually, if you peel the onion a bit, when Sunil was deciding to reject Carl and I, Sunil actually was solving a forward-looking dynamic programming algorithm and solving it with backward induction, and figured that since it's going to be at Columbia 2 years anyway, it is in his best interest to reject us, so we go to Columbia. And then when he had the phone call with Don, and Don says, well, UCLA is great, Columbia is good, up to you, Sunil didn't realize that Sunil, Carl, and I, we are just pawns. Don is the matrix. What Don was trying to tell Sunil is, hey, dude, I am the matrix. I know that you're going to come to Columbia in 2 years. And not only that, after 16 years, you're going to go to Harvard Business School. And then, just to have some fun, I'm going to record you so that you have that itch to shave off your head when you go to Harvard. So Don, thank you for creating a matrix. We love to be your fans. And the second one, I was newly married, and I thought I wrote this great paper with Don, sent it to one of the top journals in marketing. 3 months later, the reviews come back. It was not a accept. It was not a conditional accept. It was not a minor revision. It was not a major risky revision. It was not a reject and resubmit. It was a solid reject. It was one of Don's 7 rejects, but it was my first reject. So, I go home and my wife says, hey dear, look, you seem a bit down, I thought I wrote this great paper with Don and got rejected, and said, do you have any feedback? I said, yeah, here are the 3 reviews. And by the time she finished reading the first review, there were tears rolling down her eyes. She says, how could this guy be so mean to you? I said, honey, that's a good reviewer. So, anyway, and all right, talk about the future. And the nice thing about the future is, as Dave said, we can say whatever we want. And I know I'm going to link it to the morning sessions as well, too. It's going to link to what Carl talked about in the morning. How does this work? Next slide. Okay. All right. So I'm going to focus on a few things that Don is interested in: data, models, analytics, and talk about what digital customer orientation and the world. So in terms of the data going forward, I think it's going to be about better data and not big data. Better in the sense, we're going to see more of field experiments, eye tracking and facial recognition data, and how we could use it. And I'm going to give you an example of each one. The first one is a massive experiment in Austin, Texas, in electricity conservation. In terms of, there are really hot days where it's going to be, where demand will exceed the supply, and it's going to be very expensive for the utility companies to meet that, and so they want consumers to reduce electricity. So it's a large-scale, 2-year experiment, where we get data at a minute level, at a appliance level, electricity consumption. And we want to see what kind of marketing communications that we could give to the residential consumers so they can reduce electricity. So the treatments involved non-price communication. Hey, tomorrow is going to be critical peak period from 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. Do not use your air conditioning, or don't use your clothes washer, right? or tell them, hey, tomorrow is critical peak pricing. The price you're going to pay is 64 cents per kilowatt hour. Actually, give them price information. And then similarly, the same experiment during off-peak period when there is a lot of there are a lot of windy days in Austin, Texas in 5 months of the year. So there is excess supply of electricity in the grid. So how do we make them shift their load to off-peak hours from peak hours, right? And when we had the non-price communications, the treatment and control look like this. And the two vertical lines is the time between that 4 p.m. to 7 p.m. is when the critical peak period is. And you could tell that there is absolutely no change in customer behavior, right? But suddenly when you tell them the price, it has a significant decrease, right? And this also links with, I think, in earlier when you talk about consumer behavior, with the neuroscience literature in consumer behavior, that when consumers see price, a particular part of the brain, medial prefrontal cortex, lights up, and that is associated with decision making. So you can prime consumers with price for behavior change, and that's the kind of thing I'm talking about. Better data going forward with field experiments. Second is eye tracking and facial recognition, right? And with this, what you're trying to do is combining with this to understand, can we understand what's going on in the minds of the consumer? And it's got lots of applications in public safety and as well as in marketing, right? Like in China, it is doing lots of experiments in terms of, hey, instead of having armed guards everywhere, you put cameras all over the place. So even if I see a partial view of my face, they can say, hey, Praveen was here, and then he was here this morning, he went to afternoon this year, and then in the evening he went there, and then if there's some connection, they can, they can get you just by, whereas if someone wants to do some damage, if they see a armed guard, they can just go bypass them, right? But they don't know where these cameras are, right? So that's the kind of data we're talking about going forward in the next 5, 10, 15 years, right? And second is models. Again, it's going to be about better models and not complex models, right? Better models in terms of a couple of ways. One is out of sample prediction. Are we able to predict better, right? And not just predict better, are we able to explain the phenomenon? What's the process here, right? What is the link between X and Y, right? And I think that's going to be the focus. Because people talk about artificial intelligence, machine learning, and all of this, and some people use these phrases even if if they don't know what they're talking about. That, but AI and all of this is only as good as the data, the training data that is being used, and the model that's inside that, right? Even for an AI, there's got to be somebody has put a model in there, right? And that should be so good that, unless it's got discriminability, like when you have a driverless car, it's got to be able to say whether the obstruction in the front is a moving object or is a stationary object, and what should it be doing, right? So that's what I mean by it's going to be about better data, better models, right? So talking about better models, I'm talking about an example in health and analytics in healthcare, one of the areas Don is interested in. There are 7 billion people in this world. But they cannot, this is data that I collected from CDC. Center for Disease Control says that 7 billion people cannot suffer from more than 2,045 diseases. Right? And they cannot have more than 638 symptoms. Symptoms could be headache, body ache, fatigue. You cannot go to your doctor and complain more than 638 symptoms. Right? That's the max. That's finite. And then doctors elicit signs. Doctors cannot elicit more than 510 signs. Signs are, you might say, like, I have fatigue or something like that, and then doctor goes, hey, your blood pressure is high. So that's a sign, right? So they cannot elicit more than 510 signs. And then you take all these lab reports, blood work, urine work, and all of that. You cannot get more than 2,245 lab reports. Right? And then there are diagnostic imaging, like X-rays, CT scans, and on. You cannot get more than 426 diagnostic tests, right? So the point I'm trying to make is that this is a finite space we're talking about. I can easily picture a layman scholar PhD student who's interested in healthcare joining Columbia saying, hey, I can crack this shit. That, like even before physicians see the patient, right, he can create this healthcare algorithm which can use these signs and lab report diagnosis, these signs and symptoms and the lab reports and so on to the disease, right? So by the time the doctor sees the patient, doctor should have a really good idea. So essentially it augments. It doesn't replace the physician. It helps the physicians because at the end of the day, the physician only has like 15, 20 minutes to spend with you. And the throughput is really important in the hospitals. I'm really big in this cross-discipline stuff, or maybe, one of the students here would work with researchers in the healthcare area to crack this code, right? That's one way, because this is a finite space. It's not a big space, right? And the second one, if you even going forward also is, can we even predict how likely that you're going to get this disease based on data from your body, right? Let me give that as for example, if there are some, we wear all these wearable devices, right? And using that data, can we build a predictive model in terms of what the likelihood of a particular disease? And I'll expand on that in a minute. And analytics in the marketing, the current research talks a lot about personalization in terms of pricing. But if you think of all 4 Ps, you can do personalization using data from the consumers, both on giving the right price, right product, at the right place, and the right promotion at the individual level, right? Do you want this product online, or if you're traveling, because you have the geolocation data of the consumer, right? And using all of that, personalization at each of these Ps, right? And then, this is where the notion of digital customer orientation comes into play. It augments this notion of customer orientation in a way that you are getting real-time information from customers in terms of how they use your products. This is, and Carl talked about, Apple Watch Series 4 saving the life of a consumer, that this one detects your heartbeat, and see if it's irregular, it sends a signal. Imagine if that information is directly sent to your ecosystem of primary care physician and so on, that is closing the loop. You're getting that's how companies like Apple, Amazon, eBay, they're all, digital natives. The question is, how does legacy firms like Philips that makes, for example, toothbrushes, Like, for example, if there is actually a sensor in your toothbrush, and as you're brushing, it identifies, hey, there's a likelihood of a cavity in there, and sends that information to your dentist, and so on and so forth. So you can and when you have that kind of orientation at the firms, then that's what we call a digital customer orientation. That's when you can embrace these digital technologies, and so that you can provide a better experience to your customers on the dimensions that they value, right? And that's what I'm talking about, digital customer orientation. About the world, right? There are 7 billion people. Take the Americas. How many people do you think live in the Americas? In billions. Pardon? The South and North Americans. Pardon? 1 billion. Yeah, 1 billion. Right. And in Europe? Half a billion. Any others? About 1 billion in Europe. 1 billion. 1 billion. Any others? About 1 billion. 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 1 billion Africa? Africa? Yeah, 1 billion in Africa. So that leaves 4 billion here, right? And in marketing, we have the habit of calling them, well, Australia and so on is rounding error. So, there's a 4 billion people, and we have a brushstroke and saying, emerging markets, as if they're all the same, right? And back in the fall, I was hosting a conference in India, and there we invited the CEO of a big retailer in India, called the Retailers Futures Group. And he has this store called Big Bazaar, very, very popular. And so someone asked him in the audience, do you have any plans of moving to China? His response was, do you know that India, how many dialects are there in India? Language. Just in India alone. Pardon? 850 dialects. So his reply was, he says, there are so many countries in India that I am not even able to understand India, first of all. How can I understand China, right? Whereas sitting here in the West, we have this perception that, like at least broadly, I'm a broad brushstroke that, India is like one country, but India is like many, many countries. I'm just talking about India. And I think, with 4 billion people living there, I think, there's going to be much more research in trying to understand the consumers there and the richness there so that we can provide a better experience to those customers and make better marketing strategy decisions. Thank you.
Hi everyone, how are you doing? Good. Hi, I'm Olivier Toubia. I'm here at Columbia, and this is the panel time, right? So we have 4 panel members. We're going to energize you and get you ready for the reception. So Peter Golder here is from Dartmouth. Please have a seat. We have Marnik Dekimpe from Tilburg, George Day from Wharton, and Donna Hoffman from George Washington University. So thank you to all of you for participating in this nice event. So we have about 25 minutes, I think. So the plan is to give each of these wonderful scholars a few minutes to share some insights, some stories, and then actually to get some questions from the audience and make this a little bit more interactive maybe, and get people to ask them questions. So let's start maybe by giving you 3 to 5 minutes each to share some thoughts that you have about the field and also maybe some stories about Don. Peter, we want to start with you since you're at the far end of the...
Sure, thank you, Olivier. So I used my lunchtime spot in my story about Don, and my more roast story, I guess, is I still probably have some bruises from basketball from 1991 also. Also want to follow kind of Don's lead in talking about what I liked about the presentations I just saw. So I'm going to say one thing that I liked about each of the presentations. So for Leigh, I would say it's where she concluded about thinking, not where we're going to have an impact in general, but specifically in terms of context. So when are we going to, why are we going to in those situations? And that's the way to increase impact rather than just thinking kind of broadly it's going to have some impact. Because that lesson's not really translating too well to firms, but being more specific, I think, is where we can make a difference. For Greg, the part that I liked was talking about the logics within healthcare. And essentially it's like, okay, if they have a totally different logic from what we have, it's pretty hard to have an impact in that case. So in that case, it's like we're not even really learning our own lesson about being customer-oriented in terms of trying to have an impact. It's like we want to have an impact, but we want to do it on our terms instead of your terms. And that seems to be the opposite of what we're all about. So I thought that was very insightful as well. And for Praveen, where he started off in terms of the better data instead of bigger data. So I'm all in favor of that. Certainly, I have papers where my data set can fit on a sheet of paper, and those have been good in some cases. And but then on the facial recognition in that in particular, we saw Don's facial recognition feedback earlier this morning. But I think this is also an area where practice may be ahead of marketing academics. and we probably have something to learn there as well. And they can learn from us, but that collaboration I think would be useful. So those are just, at least 3 of the positive things that I took out of the talks. In terms of some things that I wanted to share with you, really just 2 things. So one is in terms of impact that I think we need to start thinking small instead of thinking big. And what I mean by that essentially is, there's a lot of talk about, how do we get these big firms, how do we get these Fortune 1000 firms to appreciate marketing? That's a really uphill climb for us, I think, and not necessarily easy to do. I think the firms that will be more receptive to us and where marketing really does have an impact would be with the smaller firms. And I'm talking about the very smallest firms. I'm talking about the firms that are seeking VC funding, possibly even before that stage, because they're all about marketing. And what we, whether they're tech or not, they're still trying to find that space where there's an unmet need. How do they find their place in the market? In our entrepreneurship program at Tuck, we teach this lean canvas methodology. What do they talk about in there? They talk about forming hypotheses and going out and doing kind of testing with consumers. That sounds pretty much to me like market research. And but I don't think we have enough to say in the entrepreneurship field, and I think we can have an impact there, more so than with large firms. And as those smaller firms grow, marketing will be more a part of their culture. So that's my first admonition, I guess, is start thinking small rather than thinking big. The second one is to focus more on failure than on success. And why I'm saying this essentially is that, a lot of marketing strategies, how do we create successful firms? Well, there's a lot of lessons to be learned from failures also. And I think as we do that, we'll learn a lot more in general. One specific point, just to touch back to what Natalie was saying about life of the brand. Life of the brand is all about failure and understanding more about failure and what time to failure is. And if we focus more on that, I think we'd also have some good lessons about really the contrast with what leads to success. So those are my 2 thoughts about think small and focus on failure.
Thank you. Marnik, you're next.
Okay, my story on Don is basically to give him a big thank you also from the European side of the community. Because a couple of years back, we wanted to make an effort to make IGRM better known also and well accepted in the US. So we thought we need someone who can bring the message. We thought about Don and said he will not want to do that. So then we talked to Don and he immediately said, yeah, the field could use an extra good journal. I'm going to think about it. An hour later, he said, I'm going to talk to my dean because we have to talk whether I can get some reduction. And by the end of the evening, he said, I'm going to do it anyway because it's important. So thanks, Don, for that. Ever since he became editor, we have seen him at EMAC. And one lesson that Don has learned in the meantime is that he should not ask my advice on what hotel to stay at the conference. Because last year in Glasgow, he said, Marnik, you're European, what hotel are you staying at? I said, I'm staying there. And so basically what we discussed the first hour is whether we could move in our room, because we were the only ones stuck in the smallest hotel ever. But we ended up in a bar next to the hotel that evening and talked about research. And what I remember about everything that we discussed about research was the recurring theme that Don always said, but that's an interesting question. And so every time, this was a weird talk we heard today. Yes, but it was an interesting question. And that's what I remember from that evening, is that work on those problems that you find interesting and the rest will follow. Then in terms a bit of the link with strategy, I was a bit inspired by the t-shirts of the doctoral students, which is show me the data. And the other thing that we really like to talk about is how big the data have become. And so one challenge I think that we have, and I talked about this also with John Roberts lately, is that how are you showing the data these days? Is it getting some obvious features of the data, or is it first coming with a bulldozer and trample the data and then get some summary statistics that basically are not really model-free evidence anyway, because you have already manipulated the data so much in order to get to some manageable summary statistics. The second concern that I have a bit with the whole big data evolution is that I have the impression that it's no longer the interest sometimes of the problem that dominates, but it's the size of the data and the magnitude of the data. And especially if sometimes if I talk with doctoral students, the first thing that they mention is the data they are working on and the size of their data, and then comes the problem. I think it would be a good idea that we keep on that first the problems come, and then that you look at the data that you can use to solve that problem, rather than the other way around. And the other thing that I think this is then to really link it with strategy is the other danger that I see is that given the sheer size of the data, that we are starting to pay less attention to problems where there are less data available. And that we are basically focusing more and more on, say, more tactical problems where the big data are indeed very useful. But if we are confronted with situations where there are less data, which very often is the case with disruptive strategic choices, that suddenly there is much less interest and much less training for that. And I think we should be careful to not fall into that trap as a profession.
Thank you very much. Donna, you're next.
Thank you. It's really an honor to be here, and it is a little intimidating. So I can see that feeling. One thing I wanted to say about Dawn, so there's been a lot about the relevance and rigor, but one of the things that's always struck me about you, Dawn, is, you know, especially, I've thought about this a lot, but especially now, this is a time in our history where I think morality is in really short supply. And Dawn has always been so selfless, and through his actions has, especially when I was a junior professor at Columbia, taught me how to treat other people, especially junior faculty, and often taking on tasks himself to lighten the load and help us be able to do more and have to teach less, or even in my case, teaching my classes when I got sick and things like that. And really, I think setting the tone for values, which I see in a lot of short supply, even in academics, where people are kind of sometimes looking out for themselves. And Dawn was always saying, looking out for everyone else. And so that was something I personally appreciated, and I think it's pretty clear from the comments here that that's really something people know about Dawn, which I really appreciate, Dawn. And I wanted to say three things. I'm doing a lot of work on AI now, impact of AI in consumer experience and marketing with Tom. And I wanted to make three observations. I think two are good, and maybe one is not so good. Praveen talked about the evolving role of the consumer. And with the advent of AI, I think there's a lot of opportunity to ask what it means to be a consumer now. And the work we're doing is looking at how objects, AI systems, smart things actually have their own kinds of experiences. And so if we start to think about what that means, that these have their own kinds of experiences, it makes sense as we think of them as having effective responses, as having consumption experiences in their own right, making decisions autonomously. We have to start thinking about whether it makes sense to market to AI. And because they will be making decisions on our behalf. And so I think that's a really important question for marketers, and I think that is definitely going to start to change marketing strategy. The second thing I wanted to raise was this idea of research on whether we can make AI think like humans. So there's a lot of work in computer science on how can we make AI be better. And there's emerging work now on what I call the 3 A's: algorithmic aversion, algorithmic appreciation, and algorithmic anxiety. And so a lot of opportunities for behavioral science research to influence how we can make algorithms more human and make them think more like humans do, but maybe without all the mistakes that we make. But the flip side of that is that we have to start to wonder whether if humans can start to think like AI, because there's a lot of concern that anthropomorphizing AI, so that's, does it think like a human, can actually set us down a very dangerous and risky path because AI is not human and not like humans. And so it becomes very important if we can start to understand what kind of experiences is it having, and can we understand those experiences? Because there'll be a lot of implications for risks and to society. And that leads me to sort of the final negative point, which is there's a big call in computer science for behavioral scientists to start working with computer scientists. So I think there are huge opportunities for marketers. And this morning, there was quite a bit of talk of maybe marketing is starting to fall out of favor. And some of that talk was also this afternoon, that maybe marketing is starting to lose its prominence. And I do see a lot of the research that in the computer science, in the HCI, in the HRI area, human-robot interaction, human-computer interaction, that they're basically doing what we should be doing, and yet we're not doing it. But the downside of that is they're starting to pick up some of the work that we do, and they're using it for negative aims, particularly in personalization. And so there's becoming this big distrust of marketing and marketers, because we can use the techniques we've developed in marketing to trick consumers, to personalize things to them that maybe they don't want, to get them to accept, choose products they don't want, to have them pay higher prices, all because of this autonomy. And so I think we have to start thinking really carefully about what marketers' role will be as this brave new world awaits.
Thank you very much, George. Next.
So I'm the end of the panel and the end of the day. Not a particularly welcome position, but I want to take advantage of it to celebrate the fact that this wonderful group is here, and we're all here for one reason: to celebrate Don Lehmann's contribution and thank him for what he's done for the field. So let's give him a big call. And I'm sure I was actually teaching this morning, and I'm so delighted that I've been able to make it here. But the problem with being in the field for 50 years is that you leave a paper trail. And I want to dissect part of that paper trail, because actually Don is on record on many of the topics of this session and of this panel. For example, and Don, you may recognize this. It's Reflections on the Futures of Marketing, edited by Don Lehmann and Kathy Jose. So Don had an interesting approach. And on one hand, he recognized that, or postulated that there might be a situation where marketing had dominant responsibility for brand equity, customer satisfaction, market orientation, and the value of customers. And that has played out in many respects. But as a prudent forecaster, he also offered an alternative scenario. And that is that marketing is diminished as a function, and so diminished that it's responsible for blue light specials. Now, how many know what a blue light special is? Put your hands up. About half the room. Well, I'm tempted to ask Dawn, because it's an extraordinarily pejorative positioning of marketing. But a blue light special is something invented by Kmart about 40 years ago, and it consisted of a blue light that flashed above a deal that was very short term. And extraordinarily tactical, non-strategic, and pretty thoughtless. So Don went on record as saying, well, these two scenarios are possibilities. Didn't come down hard on one or the other. Let's look at where we are now, and I'll wrap up with this. Both the speakers and the panelists have prompted my proposal that we have actually gained an enormous acceptance of marketing thinking. not necessarily the marketing concept, but of thinking like customers and making decisions based upon deep market insights. Markets include both customers and competitors and channel members. And that acceptance is not only embedded in companies, but it's embedded in many other disciplines. So let's think about where, and each of you in different business schools can see how operations management, strategy, management functions have absorbed this idea. For example, customer experience mapping, design thinking, customer connections, and the really hot topic in strategy these days is dynamic capabilities, which has an awful lot to do with sensing. And in fact, if you read the literature on sensing capabilities, you would think it was a marketing treatise. So it's been absorbed and integrated into a lot of other functions. And so my concluding thought would be that marketing is, and business and management of nonprofit and for-profit is a team sport. It is no longer a siloed activity. It's built upon integrated data, processes that are cross-functional, and we have a role to play there, but in support of the overall strategy. So, Don, thank you for guiding us, and best wishes.
Thank you very much. So we have time maybe for a couple of questions. Anyone has a question for the panel members?
I got a question.
Yeah, thank you.
I'm happy for a speaker. Can I do that?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, it's for Greg. The research that you presented on status, which sounds suspiciously like brand or brand reputation, the context was wine industry, correct? Yes. And so the wine industry is one domain or category where many consumers can't really tell objective quality.
Correct.
Right? So are the findings bounded by that? Are there areas where consumers can tell objective quality where the findings would not apply?
So, I think, sorry. Thanks. So the way I think about it is that wine is a sort of a case, a little bit like art, where it's very subjective. In other categories, you have more objective attributes, let's say, but also subjective ones. And I think the same sort of mechanisms apply in categories where the objective ones are more commoditized or equal, and then the subjective ones become the critical ones people use for decision making. So I actually even thought about microprocessors in this case, where microprocessors are essentially commodities, and it's the brand or the image, the other things attached to it to become the thing that influences the decision making. So it is like brand image, except for one thing, Rajiv. It's also, by virtue of the status of the brand then gets influence over the opinions of others. So it's not just an appealing brand, it's one that people look to for knowledge and for expertise, which is the connection with the academic sorts of publications.
Just could I piggyback on that to reinforce my summary comment? Again, I totally agree with Greg, but this is not the limit to the role of marketing. So in the marketing broadly defined, they've got huge channel problems. It's a multi-layer, very complex, and extremely costly. So the economics of channel management are huge. There's a lot of brand building efforts. Utterly confused customers, but a few people have figured out how to build a brand. A lot of work going on in packaging of wines. For example, cartons are potentially a big, risky area. And they need customer insights, deep marketing analysis, and consideration of alternatives. they're trying to figure out how to deal with millennials, a huge customer segment, which, by the way, doesn't particularly like either spirits or wine. And what do you do about marijuana? So I think there's a role for marketing in addressing all of those. But so how the customer relates to a wine is certainly a core part of the problem, but there's a lot of other issues.
Thank you. So Don, do you want to have a few comments to close? Yes. Yeah.
To close? Yes, I'm happy. So, about 4 comments, I think, if I can read my handwriting. First, a trivia bit. Leigh mentioned GE. I come from a GE family. I was born in Schenectady, New York.
That explains it.
Well, now, my father was at an all-expense-paid trip to a tent in France at the time, so we lived with my grandfather, who was a GE executive and became vice president of public relations and advertising. So there's something genetic here about marketing. That's the trivial one. In terms of the 4 billion point of Praveen's, Kevin and John Farley and I did a paper related to brands and brand equity and stuff like that, and sent it to a journal. And we studied people in China, India, and the US. And the review came back, what's your theoretical basis for choosing those? And I wrote back 2.5 billion. And fortunately, the editor got the message. But the reviewer was, well, what's the theory? The theory is that's half the freaking world, you idiot. And then I mentioned this, and I don't want to leave people out, but I'm going to use this as a general point. Notice on a lot of those papers, I'm the 3rd author, appropriately. You mentioned the paper, Greg mentioned the paper, said Lehman, and I said, no, it's Kim's paper. I was fortunate, this is just a recent example. I bumped into Kim when I was at Indiana, and she was a doctoral student talking about something, and I thought she was really interesting. So I said, if I can ever help, let me know. That particular paper, which showed that having marketing people on the board was helpful, especially when growth was tough, right? And the model-free evidence showed it, and we did all kinds of hoop jumping about selection and endogeneity. And it wasn't perfect, we know that, but there's no such thing as a perfect paper. And finally, the reviews say, well, we just don't believe it. We don't believe the board has any impact. Fortunately, Kim had been a C-suite executive and knew others, so she went and talked to them, and we had a whole bunch of verbatims, which we sent to the reviewers and the editors, or I should say she did, and finally they relented because they said, no, we actually are involved in a lot of that stuff. So the realism coming in there was really useful, and I've been fortunate to co-author with like 180 people, and I've learned something from all of them. And I believe I have truckloads of peas to deliver. A phrase I used, the story and not told about peas. There's a longer one. It comes from a guy named Eric Hoffa, who was a teamster and longshoreman, and it's about his journey across the Midwest during the Depression, the Dust Bowl, and he was the one who couldn't fill the peas and gave up. So the way I concluded it, which Anat reminded me later, is I have a truckload of peas to deliver, and I actually feel that way. And importantly, to have a truckload of peas to deliver, I think people need a drink. So I'm done. I move to adjourn.